Something very strange might be happening at the start of the 2026 Formula One season. Because after Australia, and now after the Chinese sprint weekend, the team that looks the most comfortable in this brand new regulation era is Mercedes. They topped practice, locked out the front row in sprint qualifying, won the sprint race, and looked like they are the best team to understood the tires and the energy system better so far. Meanwhile, Ferrari are experimenting with a rear wing that literally flips 180 degrees. McLaren are trying to find balance, and Red Bull seems to still have some issues in the car. So in this video, we're going to go through everything that happened in China so far. FP1, sprint qualifying, the sprint race. What each team is doing, what drivers and engineers are saying about these new 2026 cars, and what to expect from Sunday's race. Starting with FP1, so the weekend started with the only one practice session. George Russell finished fastest in FP1, with Kimi Antonelli second and Lando Norris third. Now, one thing that people immediately noticed watching the onboards and sector times was how the Mercedes behaved on the long Shanghai straight. The car was quick at the start of the straight, and it looked like it lost less speed at the end of it, which is important this year because the 2026 cars run out of electric energy halfway down the straight and start dropping speed. It seems so far that Mercedes are using this new energy system more efficient than the other teams. At the same time, Ferrari showed decent pace, but were experimenting with the interesting 180-degree flipping rear wing. But they removed it in the next sessions. It seems like they were checking the best options for long straights in China. And Red Bull still not look very comfortable. Moving on to the sprint qualifying, the top six ended up being Russell, Antonelli, Norris, Hamilton, Piastri, and Leclerc. So Mercedes locked out the front row, McLaren and Ferrari filled the next positions, and already you could see the emerging competitive order. Throughout qualifying, Red Bull was clearly struggling with grip and drivability, resulting in Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar getting 8th and 10th. Meanwhile, Ferrari didn't perform as good as they wanted. Charles Leclerc had an issue on his qualifying lap related to energy deployment, which showed how incredibly sensitive these new power units are. So a small system problem can completely ruin a lap, which is very critical in qualifying sessions. Then we had the sprint race. Right at the start, Kimi Antonelli had a bad launch, dropping from the front row all the way down to 7th place, which immediately left George Russell alone at the front. Behind him, Lewis Hamilton made a brilliant start and took the lead, while Charles Leclerc started working his way forward up to P3 after qualifying 6th. So Russell ended up in a very interesting situation, effectively racing both Ferraris at the same time. Russell later said something about that battle. He said the first corner was tricky because you could easily damage the left tires, and that throughout the fight he believed that he could pass Hamilton, but he wasn't sure he could keep the position afterwards. Which tells you how much tire management and energy management matter in these cars. Then the race got even more interesting when a safety car came out after Nico Hülkenberg's stranded Audi needed to be recovered. That triggered pit stops for the leading drivers, and for a moment Ferrari almost made another strategy mistake that allowed Norris to jump Hamilton. Norris briefly gained the position, but Hamilton managed to take it back a few laps later. Charles Leclerc continued his charge, starting from P6 on the grid all the way to P2 as he passed Hamilton before the safety car, and finishing only 0.6 seconds behind Russell at the finish. So by the end of the sprint, the order at the front showed that Mercedes and Ferrari looked like the two strongest packages so far. McLaren looked solid, but slightly behind them, and Red Bull still looked uncomfortable with the car. So if we step back and look at the overall picture after FP1, sprint qualifying, and the sprint race, a few clear headlines are emerging. Mercedes might currently have the most complete package. Ferrari looks like the team with the strongest race pace potential. McLaren is competitive, but still finding consistency. And Red Bull is the team with the biggest questions. The drivers are still having some problems with the strange energy management effect on straights, where cars visibly slow down halfway through a straight once the electric energy runs out. And to be honest, it seems like it makes the racing more tactical. But some say that it looks unnatural. Either way, teams are still learning how to extract performance from these completely new machines. If you compress everything we've seen so far into one simple conclusion, the early picture of this 2026 season is becoming clearer. Mercedes and Ferrari currently seem to have the strongest fundamental car platforms. Ferrari showed particularly impressive race pace in the sprint. Charles Leclerc's drive from P6 to P2 was one of the highlights of the race, finishing only about 6/10 behind Russell at the end after the late safety car shuffled strategies and forced the leaders into quick decisions. Hamilton also looked far more comfortable with the car. He had strong straight-line speed and even managed to lead the race briefly after a great launch. After the sprint, he mentioned that the car feels much better and that the overall direction is encouraging, even if he wasn't entirely happy going from leading at one point to finishing third. Still, his comments suggested Ferrari believe there is a lot more performance to unlock as the season progresses. Mercedes, however, had one very clear advantage during the sprint, something we already began noticing in Australia: tire management. Russell was able to maintain his tires in a much healthier window, while the Ferraris had to push harder to stay close. Over the course of the race, this allowed him to control the gap and avoid putting himself under unnecessary pressure. The opening laps were particularly intense, and it was noticeable how much the tires were suffering after those early fights. Russell later mentioned how tricky the first corner can be for the front left tire, which becomes a key factor when drivers are battling aggressively at the start. Another detail that analysts and commentators highlighted is how efficient the Mercedes seems to be when managing the new 2026 hybrid systems. These cars lose electric deployment partway through the straights, and several teams appear to drop more speed at that moment than Mercedes does. That suggests the team may have found a very effective way to integrate the power unit and energy deployment with the car's overall balance. McLaren currently looks like the third strongest team. Norris and Piastri were consistently fighting within the Ferrari group, but never quite had the pace to challenge Russell directly. The car appears competitive, but still slightly behind the top two teams in overall consistency. Red Bull, meanwhile, remains the biggest surprise of the weekend. Sprint qualifying did not go well, with Verstappen and Hadjar only managing 8th and 10th, and the car looked uncomfortable in several corners. For a team that dominated the previous era of Formula One, seeing them struggle to find the right balance this early in the regulation cycle is definitely unexpected. Of course, it is still early in the season, and teams are only beginning to understand these completely new cars. Development will be constant, and the order could change quickly. So tell me in the comments, what are your takes on the season so far? And what do you expect in the next race?